All right. So the story of the origins of American Jewry is one chapter of a much larger story of the repercussions of the expulsion from Spain in 1492 as a result of the Spanish Inquisition. And what happened is, as we'll see here, when Jews left Spain and then also left Portugal, fleeing the Inquisition, they went all over the world, as you can see. And some of them went to Western Europe, to France, and to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam, which will become an important part of our story in a second. And others went, as you can see, east to places like Northern Africa, to Algeria, Tunisia, to Egypt, to the Middle East, and to the Ottoman Empire. Our story concerns those Sephardic Jews who left, and also the descendants of conversos, that is to say, Jews who converted to Catholicism, but then continued to live secretly as Jews in one form or another, and made their way to Amsterdam. Amsterdam at this time, we're talking about the 16th century, the 17th century, the 1500s, the 1600s, was an extremely tolerant place for Jews to live, and very attractive for that reason. And so Jews who went there, many of them were merchants, were traders, and became involved in the Dutch colonial projects in the New World. And that is going to be ultimately how Jews make their way to North America. By 1645, there are about 1,450 Jews living in the Dutch colony of Brazil. That's a pretty big size for a colonial Jewish community. And they're making a living as artisans, as merchants in the sugar trade. A few of them are wealthy enough to own sugar plantations, but that's the exception. In 1654, after about a decade of ongoing conflict, Portugal takes Brazil back from the Dutch. Previously, Brazil had been a Portuguese colony until 1630, so they've been fighting over it and trading hands. So the fact that Brazil has now reverted back to Portuguese control, this is very bad news for the Jews living in Brazil, because everywhere that that Portugal goes, it's going to institute the Inquisition. So all Jews remaining in Brazil are given 3 months to leave, and those conversos who had returned to Judaism while living under the tolerant rule of the Dutch now face the potential of being captured by the Inquisition. So most of the Jews in Brazil decide to go back to Amsterdam. Makes sense. Others go to other colonies in the New World where they expect life to be better. For reasons that we're not entirely clear on, 23 of these exiles, these Jewish exiles from Dutch Brazil, get on a boat and go to New Netherland, the Dutch colony in North America. And there they encounter Peter Stuyvesant, who is the governor in New Amsterdam, the capital. And Stuyvesant is not at all happy about these Jewish refugees who have washed up on his shore, and he writes a letter back to Amsterdam asking for permission to kick these Jews out. And we're going to look now at this letter. Here is Peter Stuyvesant writing to the Amsterdam Chamber of Directors in September 1654. The Jews who have arrived would nearly all like to remain here, but learning that they, with their customary usury and deceitful trading with the Christians, were very repugnant to the inferior magistrates, as also to the people having the most affection for you, the deaconry, which takes care of the poor, also fearing that owing to their present indigence, due to the fact that they had been captured and robbed by privateers or pirates, they might become a charge in the coming winter, we have, for the benefit of this weak and newly developing place and the land in general, deemed it useful to require them in a friendly way to depart, praying also most seriously in this connection for ourselves as also for the general community of your worships, that the deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, be not allowed further to infect and trouble this new colony, to the detraction of your worships and the dissatisfaction of your worship's most affectionate subjects. So Governor Stuyvesant does not like these Jews who have come to New Amsterdam seeking refuge. And he doesn't like them for a number of reasons. Number one, he claims that they are sneaky. And he repeats some very common anti-Semitic tropes here, right? That they are deceitful in trade, that they practice usury, right, which is lending at interest. On the other hand, he says, they're arriving poor, and he claims that having to provide for the welfare of these Jewish refugees is going to tax the treasury and the resources of the Dutch colony. So on the one hand, right, Jews are sneaky in business, and they charge interest when they lend you money. But on the other hand, they're poor, so we don't want them because they're poor and because they're going to get rich off of us. And he also makes a religious argument, right, that Jews are, he says, hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ, and so we don't want them for that reason. Stuyvesant, it should be said, was an equal opportunity bigot, right? There's lots of other varieties of Christianity that he didn't care for, but he certainly included Jews among the targets of his ire. So this group of 23 Jews is in trouble. So what do? They write back to the Amsterdam Jewish community, and they ask for help. So the Jewish community writes this letter to the directors of the Chartered West India Company, right? The West India Company is running the Dutch colonial venture, right? So they have oversight over everything that's happening in New Netherland. And I'm going to read most of this letter. I might skip some of it just so that we don't get too bogged down and can get to all the neat documents and stories that we're going to talk about this afternoon. To the Honorable Lords, Directors of the Chartered West India Company, Chamber of the City of Amsterdam. This is January 1655 now. The merchants of the Portuguese nation, that is to say, the Sephardic Jewish community, residing in the city of Amsterdam, respectfully remonstrate to your honors that it has come to their knowledge that your honors raise obstacles to the giving of permits or passports to the Portuguese Jews to travel and to go to reside in New Netherland, which, if persisted in, will result to the great disadvantage of the Jewish nation. It can also be of no advantage to the general company, but rather damaging. There are many of the nation who have lost their possessions at Pernambuco and have arrived from there in great poverty, and part of them have been dispersed here and there. So the first argument, I'm going to stop and make comments here. Like the first argument as to why the Jews should be allowed to stay in New Amsterdam. They're refugees. They're poor. They have nothing. Right? Have mercy on them. And right, they can't go to Spain or Portugal because of the Inquisition. So they have nowhere else to turn. Skipping to the top of the second column, it is well known to your honors that the Jewish nation in Brazil have at all times been faithful and have striven to guard and maintain that place, risking for that purpose their possessions and their blood. Jews have been good and loyal citizens under the Dutch crown. So you should remember that loyalty. And in the next paragraph, they continue that Jews have, quote, in political matters always protected, that the lords have in political matters always protected and considered the Jewish nation as upon the same footing as all the inhabitants and burghers. So there's legal precedent for, the Dutch crown and the government to protect its Jewish citizens in Amsterdam. Why not in the Dutch colonies, right? Why do the rights of Jews living under Dutch rule in Europe differ from those of Jews living under Dutch rule in the colonies. And then finally, and here's the kicker, this is the third paragraph on the right side of the page. Your Honor should also please consider that many of the Jewish nation are principal shareholders in the West India Company. They, having always striven their best for the company, and many of their nation have lost immense and great capital in its shares and obligations. In other words, not only have the Jews been good citizens, not only is there historical precedent for toleration and protection on the part of the Dutch government for its Jewish citizens, but there are Jews who own shares in the West India Company. And therefore, right, let's not act too rashly toward those shareholders and their fellow Jews, or what might happen. So it's interesting to me to see how, in terms of the rhetorical strategy, trying to butter them up and make them seem pathos, right? That these poor refugees are in need of your help. Also, we own shares in your company, so you'd better listen to us. So here is how the Amsterdam Chamber of the West India Company finally replies to Governor Stuyvesant. So now this is April 26th of 1655. Honorable, prudent, pious, dear, faithful Stuyvesant. Anytime a letter starts with those kind of butter you up adjectives before you know the bad news is coming. We would have liked to effectuate and fulfill your wishes and request that the new territories should no more be allowed to be infected by people of the Jewish nation, for we foresee therefrom the same difficulties which you fear. But after having further weighed and considered the matter, we observe that this would be somewhat unreasonable and unfair, especially because of the considerable loss sustained by this nation with others in the taking of Brazil, and as also because of the large amount of capital which they still have invested in the shares of this company. So there you see the arguments of the Amsterdam Jewish community being repeated by the West India Company directors. Therefore, after many deliberations, we have finally decided upon a certain petition presented by said Portuguese Jews that these people may travel and trade to and in New Netherland and live and remain there, provided the poor among them shall not become a burden to the to the company or to the community, but be supported by their own nation. You will now govern yourself accordingly. So, in some ways, this is a compromise, right? Stuyvesant wanted to expel the Jewish community, the newly formed Jewish community of New Amsterdam, and he can't. But on the other hand, the Jews who are coming to live there, while they're allowed to stay, they don't have full and complete civil rights. And immediately the stipulation is that they have to take care of themselves, right? This community has to provide for its own poor and not expect the resources of the Dutch colony to be there for them. So it's very much a conditional acceptance. And there's more not contained in this letter. Jews could not at first worship together in public in New Amsterdam. That is a right that was denied to them at first and is only extended to them in time. By 1664, when Britain conquers New Netherland and renames it New York, nearly all of the Jews who first settled there have moved on. The next important outpost of Jewish life in the colonies was in Newport, Rhode Island, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. Jews went there because they enjoyed a much more liberal policy of toleration, as well as access to a better developed port than New York could offer at the time. And here you can see a map of where the early centers of American Jewish life are. New York City, we would expect. Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah are the largest Jewish communities in the colonies. And actually, Charleston becomes the largest of them all. And until about 1800, Charleston has America's largest Jewish community, which is a fascinating fact and a reminder that Southern Jewish history is an important part of American Jewish history as well. It's no accident that Jews settled in port cities, not because they had to, but because most Jews made a living in trade and commerce. And if you made a living in trade and commerce in the 1700s, you needed to be close to the water, right? Close to the ships. Those were the hubs of colonial commercial activity. Interestingly, the majority of the early settlers to the Jewish settlers to the American colonies, like that group of 23 that we met in 1654, were of Sephardic origin. And Sephardic culture and customs really dominated in early American Jewish life. Although by 1720, most of the Jews coming to the American colonies were actually of Ashkenazi origin, from Central and Eastern Europe, right? Not Sephardic. It's also important to mention that we're talking about a very, very small American Jewish community. By 1820, which is going to function as our stopping point for this presentation, there are only about 2,500 Jews in the entire United States. Very much a small and relatively insignificant Jewish community when you consider other Jewish communities in the world in the early 1800s. Of course, that will change. Early synagogues in American Jewish life include Shereth Israel in New York, which dates to 1706, Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, which dates to 1730, and the Touro Synagogue, not pictured here, but we will talk about it momentarily. The Touro Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island, which was established in 1763. Now I want to pivot to talking about the economic life of early American Jews. We hinted at it when we mentioned that the vast majority lived in port cities, but let's get a better idea of how some of these families made their living. And a few of them did become quite wealthy. Jewish settlements in the colonies functioned as outposts within wider trading networks between Amsterdam, London, and the Atlantic world. To a large extent, this was a network built and sustained by family connections. Large Jewish merchant families sent brothers, sons, and uncles to various destinations in the New World to serve as their representatives. These families would also marry off their sons and daughters to each other, further cementing business ties through lineage. Jews relied on each other to do much international business, trading in sugar, barley, rice, horses, furniture, and other goods. We won't talk about it very much today, but some Jews did participate in the slave trade. I want to talk for a moment about one well-known colonial Jewish family in particular, and that would be the Franks family. Jacob Franks arrived in New York from England in 1708 as the son of a well-entrenched, prominent London merchant family. 4 years later, he married Abigail Levy, the daughter of Moses Levy, a prominent Jewish merchant in New York, and thus forged a business partnership with his new father-in-law. Jacob and Abigail had 3 sons, Naphtali Franks, who went back to work in London, David, who settled in Philadelphia, and Moses, who went back to London eventually as well. A nephew of Jacob's, a man named Moses Solomons, went down to Charleston, giving the family an important trading partner in the southern port city. Abigail Franks is very well known to us. She wrote frequent letters to family members and friends about her daily life, about the challenges of living so far from her children. And these letters have been collected and published, and they're a really fascinating insight into what daily life was like at this time. I was reviewing them earlier today in advance of teaching this class, and it feels oddly relevant in this moment, when we are all staying at home and are physically distanced from many of our family and friends. And that was what life was like for Abigail. Her oldest son, Naphtali, was in London. Right? She was in New York. And her only means of communication with her son, there was no Zoom, there was no Facebook, there was no email, was writing letters. I want to share with you an excerpt of one of Abigail's letters to her son, Naphtali. Naphtali, his nickname was Heartsey. So that's why you'll see the letters addressed to Dear Heartsey. October 18th, 1741. I wish writing was as great a pleasure to me as receiving a letter from you is. Then you should not so often have cause to complain of my omission, though I think I write by every opportunity that goes directly to London. However, if I don't, I have you always at heart, and if there was not so many others in the family who are always writing to you, be assured I should be more careful. Just as an aside, the genre of family letter writing, usually it's the children who are apologizing for not writing or not calling. Here it's the mother who's apologizing to her son. I'm going to skip a little bit into the middle of the second page. As I have my health perfectly well and don't know anything I wish for but the happiness of seeing you, which I begin to fear I never shall, for I don't wish you here. And I am sure there is little probability of my going to England. If parents would give themselves leave to consider the many difficulties that attends the bringing up of children, there would not be such immoderate joy at their birth. I don't mean the care of their infancy, that's the least, but it's after they are grown up and behave in such a manner as to give satisfaction. Then to be bereaved of them in the decline of life, when the enjoying of them would be our greatest happiness. For the cares of getting a living disperses them up and down the world, and the only pleasure we enjoy, and that's intermixed with anxiety, is to hear they do well, which is a pleasure I hope to have, and that all the blessing and felicity attendant on the good and virtuous may be your lot. Such a powerful letter, I think, and the longings that it expresses are really remarkable, and something, again, I think all of us can relate to in this time of social distancing, and those of us who are parents can relate to as well. I want to tell you about one other extremely prominent colonial American Jew, probably the most prominent of his time and the wealthiest as well, and a man with a very interesting biography. Aaron Lopez was born in Portugal in 1731, and his name was Duarte Lopez, and he was born to a converso family, a family that was outwardly Christian, but inwardly, secretly maintained a Jewish identity. In 1752, so he would have been 20 or 21 years old, Aaron left Lisbon and came to Newport, Rhode Island. And living in Rhode Island, he discovered religious freedom, re-embraced Judaism and Jewish identity, changed his name from Duarte to Aaron, got himself circumcised at age in his early 20s, and became in time a pillar of the Newport Jewish community. He made his fortune trading lots of different commodities, including slaves, but not primarily. His primary business was in whale oil, making candles. Remember, there's no electricity. It gets dark and you need to see, and everybody wants candles and whale oil candles. So I am told, I'm not an expert in this, were of a particularly superior quality. So Lopez comes to the colonies, to Newport, embraces Judaism, makes a fortune for himself. There is this complicated side of his legacy that involves slave trade, but we don't have time to necessarily dwell on it now. But there's this really neat letter that we have that was a letter sent to Aaron Lopez from a man named Henry Israel in St. Anne's, Jamaica, in July of 1770. And I'm going to read it and then share some comments on it with you. So this is Henry Israel writing from Jamaica to Aaron Lopez of Newport in 1770. Sir, meeting with this favorable opportunity, I've embraced it. I am hopeful you'll excuse my taking the liberty and troubling of you in this letter. I live in the country, and we are obliged to live very hard, as we can't get such sort of provisions as is suitable to our religion without sending to the towns in Jamaica. It is then a great length and chargeable, and what we get is very poor stuff and dear. I would therefore be kindly obliged to you if you would be so kind as to take the trouble found in sending by the return of Captain Potter for St. Anne's 2 good large barrel of good kosher beef, fat and prime pieces, and will send you the payment by the return of the same vessel. I must also beg you'll send me it as reasonable as possible, as I have a large family, and I have enough to do to support 'em genteelly. If you'll please inquire of Captain James Potter of me, or of Captain Hefferon, they will tell you, or of any other of the captains that trades here. I have been in this parish going on 42 years. Captain John Freebody, Jr., who was here in the year 53, at a circumcision of one of my sons, can tell you. I am unacquainted with your person or family, but I hope they enjoy their health. I am with esteem, sir, your most obedient servant, Henry Israel. And then he closes, Nota bene, if you can, or if it would be agreeable, I would be much obliged to you to have packed up in one of the barrels a few tongues. So what's going on here? Henry Israel is a Jewish man with a large family living in Jamaica. And it seems, right, that he is very much an observant Jew. He tells us that he circumcised his son, and he's trying to get kosher meat. It's very hard to get kosher meat in Jamaica in 1770. So what does he do? He sends a letter to Aaron Lopez in Newport, a man he doesn't know personally, right? Only knows by reputation. And he says effectively, Mr. Lopez, would you please pack up a bunch of kosher meat for me, nice kosher meat, put it on a ship, send it down to me, and then I will send you the money by the next ship. And here are some, references that you can consult with, people you can ask to, so that you'll know that I'm good for it. I'm honorable. Astounding, right? I mean, think about, again, how we are used to doing our food shopping in 2020. Again, you can't help but think about historical parallels and the strange moment that we're living in. But the lengths that this person, Henry Israel, is willing to go to try to get kosher meat down in St. Anne's, Jamaica, the fact that he knows who Aaron Lopez is, and thinks that there's actually a reasonable chance that Aaron Lopez will do this for his fellow Jew living in Jamaica is quite remarkable. Now, we don't have, as far as I know, a response from Aaron Lopez. So I don't know if Aaron Lopez sent Mr. Israel some meat or not. But I just love this letter for so many reasons. So much it teaches us about the interconnectedness of Jews living in different parts of the world, and how they communicated, and how they seem to rely on each other in order to be able to lead observant Jewish lives, which is a theme we'll come back to at the end of this presentation. I'm not going to dwell at great length on the American Revolution. I will say that it was an important milestone in terms of American Jews staking a claim to citizenship and full participation in the new country. There were Jews that were Tories that supported the British, that thought the American Revolution was a bit of a foolhardy or disloyal venture. They were a minority, however, right? Most Jews living in the colonies supported the revolutionary cause. On a basic level, this makes sense when we remember that, again, most Jews are making their living as merchants, as traders, as artisans, and the British are in the process on the eve of the revolution of doing what? Levying higher taxes. So if I'm a Jewish merchant, right, it makes sense that my sympathies might lie with getting out from under the yoke of British taxation. Jews such as Colonel Isaac Franks and Benjamin Nonis fought for the Continental Army under George Washington, while others such as Chaim Solomon, a Philadelphia broker and businessman, provided Washington's army with important material and financial support. Jews were, on the whole, very eager to demonstrate their loyalty to this new nation, which they believed would grant them full civic equality. Having come from other places around the globe, they were fully cognizant and appreciative of the potential of the new United States to provide them with full rights and inclusion. And no episode better illustrates that hope and faith in what the United States could offer Jews than this famous exchange between President George Washington and the Jewish community of Newport. This is one of my favorite things to teach. So George Washington, president, is touring the country, kind of a goodwill tour, and meeting with the citizens. And he comes to Rhode Island. Rhode Island in 1790 had just ratified the Constitution, so now Washington is going to come for a visit. And Moses Satius, who is the warden of the Truro Synagogue, and here it is, you waited for a picture, you waited very patiently, established in 1764, writes a letter of gratitude to Washington, and he reads it in the presence of Washington and the Newport Jewish community. It's a remarkable letter. Here it is in the original on the right side, and I'm going to read the legible version on the left. Message of welcome to George Washington, August 17th, 1790. Sir, permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits, and to join with our fellow citizens in welcoming you to Newport. With pleasure, we reflect on those days of difficulty and danger, when the God of Israel, who delivered David from the peril of the sword, shielded your head in the day of battle. And we rejoice to think that the same Spirit who rested in the bosom of the greatly beloved Daniel, enabling him to preside over the provinces of the Babylonish Empire, rests and will ever rest upon you, enabling you to discharge the arduous duties of chief magistrate in these states. Deprived as we have hitherto been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with a deep sense of gratitude to the Almighty Disposer of all events, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but generously affording to all liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship, deeming every one of whatever nation, tongue, or language equal parts of the great governmental machine. This so ample and extensive federal union, whose basis is philanthropy, mutual confidence, and public virtue, we cannot but acknowledge to be the work of the great God, who ruleth in the armies of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, doing whatsoever seemeth him good. For all the blessings of civil and religious liberty which we enjoy under an equal and benign administration, we desire to send up our thanks to the Ancient of Days, the great preserver of men, beseeching him that the angel who conducted our forefathers through the wilderness into the promised land may graciously conduct you through all the dangers and difficulties of this mortal life. And when like Joshua, full of days and full of honor, you are gathered to your fathers, may you be admitted into the heavenly paradise to partake of the water of life and the tree of immortality. Done and signed by order of the Hebrew Congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, August 17th, 1790, Moses Seixas Ward. This is, I think, a truly remarkable letter for a number of reasons. Let's start with the ways in which this letter addresses President Washington. I'm sure as you were reading the letter or listening to my reading of it, there were a number of Old Testament references that I'm sure caught your eye, right? The God of Israel who delivered David from the peril of the sword. Daniel, who presided over Babylonia, right? The same God that protected David and Daniel, we pray will protect you. Also, right, the angel who conducted our forefathers through the wilderness into the promised land may graciously conduct you, President Washington, through all the dangers and difficulties of this mortal life. And again, comparing George Washington at the end to Joshua. These biblical allusions are not accidental. And they're not only there to express well wishes, but I think there's a deeper rhetorical move going on here, which is that by comparing Washington to David and Daniel and Joshua, right, great leaders in ancient Jewish history, implicitly what the Jews of Newport are saying is that Washington is on par with them, right? Washington is a Jewish hero, perhaps in the way that if we go back in Jewish history, Cyrus of Persia, who allowed the Jews to rebuild the temple after the Babylonians destroyed it, was in some cases a Jewish hero. So if that's the case, then the American Revolution becomes an event in Jewish history, like the Exodus, like entering the Promised Land. That's what I think these metaphors are hinting at. And why is the American Revolution such an important event in Jewish history? Because deprived as we Jews have hitherto been of the invaluable rights of free citizens, we now, with thanks to God, behold a government erected by the majesty of the people, a government which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance, but affords to all liberty of conscience. This is a major event in Jewish history. If we look around the world in 1790, we don't find many other places where Jews enjoy those kind of civil rights. This is an incredible development, hence the gratitude, hence the Old Testament allusions. However, I think there's also a hint of anxiety in this letter, right? Because they are doing a lot of buttering up to Washington. The Constitution has just been ratified, but that doesn't mean that it won't be amended. So all of these new wonderful freedoms that the Jews of Newport are blessed with in 1790, there's not quite a guarantee that they will endure. So as much as they are celebrating their liberty in this letter, they're also trying to make Washington, try to impress or express to George Washington how important it is to them, how grateful they are for the rights and liberties that they enjoy as Americans, and that they hope they'll be able to continue to enjoy. So Seixas writes and reads this letter in the presence of Washington and the Jews of Newport, and then George Washington writes them back. Again, a pretty remarkable event in Jewish history, right? That the sovereign leader of a nation would reply favorably to a letter from a Jewish community. A reply to the Hebrew Congregation of Newport, August 17th, 1790. George Washington. Gentlemen, while I receive with much satisfaction your address, replete with expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain a grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced in my visit to Newport from all classes of citizens. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger which are past is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we have wisdom to make the best use of the advantages with which we are now favored, we cannot fail, under the just administration of a good government, to become a great and happy people. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. It would be inconsistent with the frankness of my character not to avow that I am pleased with your favorable opinion of my administration and fervent wishes for my felicity. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way, everlastingly happy. George Washington. So Washington, much to the relief of the Jews of Newport, echoes and affirms their sentiments. He also echoes their use of Old Testament language, which is a reflection of the fact that Washington himself is a devout person, that those references and metaphors are as meaningful to him as they are to the Jews of Newport. And he also affirms that Jews will be welcomed in the United States, not tolerated because of their differences, but accepted as equals. And that is quite a remarkable development in Jewish history. And of course, the Bill of Rights, Article 1, guarantees Americans' right of religious freedom without government interference. That is the enshrinement of the ideas that Washington was communicating to the Jews of Newport about. One of the reasons why America will become such a haven for Jews in the 1800s and the 1900s is because of this principle of religious freedom. But religious freedom, of course, also comes with a cost. And that is that just as you are free to observe your religion as you wish, you are also free not to observe your religion as you wish. And I want to end this presentation. Hold that thought. I forgot I had this here. This is so you can see in 1830, at the end of the period under conversation today, how many Jews are living in the United States and where are they living. So the columns to the right are the Jewish populations of the various major cities. And you can see by 1830, New York is the biggest, but there's only 1,150 Jews in New York in 1830. So a very, very, very small number. And then Philadelphia and Charleston are the second largest, and all the others are significantly smaller than that. This doesn't mean that all Jews lived in those 9 or 10 cities, though. There were Jews living in smaller rural places. And in those more remote Jewish communities, as I was alluding to a minute ago, it was very difficult for somebody who was committed to remaining an observant Jew to do so. Just as we saw that Henry Israel in St. Anne's, Jamaica, had to try to get kosher meat by writing to Aaron Lopez in Rhode Island. Here is a letter from a woman named Rebecca Samuel, who was born in Hamburg in Germany and is living in Petersburg, Virginia in 1791. And here's a letter that she writes to her parents about what it's like to be Jewish in Petersburg, Virginia in 1791. Dear and worthy parents, I received your dear letter with much pleasure and therefrom understand that you are in good health, thank God, and that made us especially happy. The same is not lacking with us. May we live to be 100 years. Amen. And here you see in the next paragraph more complaining about not getting letters. A timeless theme, I guess, in the history of families, right? You don't write, you don't call enough. I'm skipping that second paragraph and reading the third. Actually, let me go up a few to the middle of that second paragraph. Now you can realize that we too have been somewhat worried. We are completely isolated here. We do not have any friends, and when we do not hear from you for any length of time, it is enough to make us sick. I hope that I will get to see some of the family. That will give me some satisfaction. You write me that Mr. Jacob Renner's son Reuben is in Philadelphia and that he will come to us. People will not advise him to come to Virginia. When the Jews of Philadelphia or New York hear the name Virginia, they get nasty. And they are not wrong. It won't do for a Jew. In the first place, it is an unhealthful district, and we are only human. God forbid if anything should happen to us, where would we be thrown? There is no Jewish cemetery in the whole of Virginia. In Richmond, which is 22 miles from here, there is a Jewish community consisting of 2 quorums, that is to say, 2 minyanim, and the 2 cannot muster a quarter. In other words, that is to say, there are about 20 Jews in Richmond, but they can't get 4 Jews to join together in prayer. You cannot imagine what kind of Jews they have here in Virginia. They were all German itinerants who made a living by begging in Germany. They came to America during the war as soldiers, and now they can't recognize themselves. One can make a good living here and all live at peace. Anyone can do what he wants. There is no rabbi in all of America to excommunicate anyone. There is a blessing here. Jew and Gentile are as one. There is no galut. Galut, of course, means exile. Here, the editor thinks that she means it as rejection of Jews or discrimination. In New York and Philadelphia, there is more galut. The reason is that there are too many German Gentiles and Jews there. The German Gentiles cannot forsake their anti-Jewish prejudice, and German Jews cannot forsake their disgraceful conduct. And that's what makes galut. In another letter, Rebecca then goes on to tell her parents that they're leaving Virginia. The whole reason we are leaving this place is because of its lack of Yiddishkeit, or Jewishness. Dear parents, I know quite well you will not want me to bring up my children like Gentiles. Here, they cannot become anything else. Jewishness is pushed aside here. There are here in Petersburg 10 or 12 Jews, and they are not worthy of being called Jews. We have a shochet, right, a Jewish kosher slaughterer, who goes to the market and buys treifa, unkosher meat, and then brings it home. On Rosh Hashanah and on Yom Kippur, the people worshipped here without one Sefer Torah, and not one wore a talit. You can believe me that I crave to see a synagogue to which I can go. The way we live now is no life at all. We do not know what the Sabbath and the holidays are. On the Sabbath, all the Jewish shops are open, and they do business on that day as they do throughout the whole week. But ours, we do not allow to open. With us, there is still some Sabbath. You must believe that in our house, we all live as Jews as much as we can. So you can hear the ambivalence and the frustration in Rebecca's voice about what it's like to be Jewish in early America. On the one hand, there are many blessings. America offers freedom. It offers safety. It offers equality. Rebecca and her family are not worried about mobs looking for Jews running down the street with torches. They're not worried about making a living. They seem to be doing okay financially. But on the other hand, it's very, very hard to be Jewish in Petersburg, Virginia. And she complains that many of her fellow Jews in town have already begun to assimilate and lose touch with her Jewishness. Eventually, they'll move to Richmond, where they'll become part of a slightly larger Jewish community and more vibrant one. This is a good place for us to end. What we've done today is we've managed to get, hopefully, a interesting and detailed look at what the earliest chapter of American Jewish history is like. And hopefully in our next session, we will move forward into the 19th century and explore the flowering of American Jewish life at a time when the Jewish community goes from about 2,000 or 3,000 to 250,000 by 1880. That'll be the subject of a program we hope to do in the very near future. I want to thank all of you for listening to this program. If you have questions and you'd like to contact me, my email address is jf36@rice.edu. And as I mentioned, I am the curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive, and I look forward to doing more of this with you in the future. Thank you very much.